Apple, the company known for its elegant ecosystem, suddenly announces something no one ever saw coming, its own Linux distribution, a fully Apple-branded Linux-powered operating system. The internet explodes, developers cheer, hardcore Linux fans raise an eyebrow, and the tech world starts asking one simple question: why now? For decades, Apple has built its success on control. From the hardware to the software, from macOS to iOS, everything fits perfectly into Apple's walled garden. But what if one day Apple decided to open that gate just a little and step into the world of Linux? It would be a move that changes everything we know about both Apple and open source. Let's imagine what that world would look like. The first thing Apple would bring to Linux is design. The desktop environment would look stunning. Picture something inspired by macOS, the dock at the bottom, rounded corners, a translucent control center, and subtle animations that make everything feel alive. No lag, no stutter, just silky smooth performance. Apple would pour its design magic into every pixel. It wouldn't look like NOM, KDE, or XFCE. It would look like something completely new, a blend of elegance and minimalism that only Apple could pull off. Even the terminal would have personality, with clean typography, subtle motion effects, and seamless integration with Apple's cloud ecosystem. Then there's performance. Apple's Linux distro would be built to run flawlessly on Apple Silicon M1, M2, M3, and beyond. With Apple's deep hardware optimization, it could easily become the fastest Linux desktop ever made. Boot times would be near instant, battery life unmatched, and resource efficiency next level. Imagine compiling code, rendering video, or running virtual machines, all without your fan even turning on. Apple's kernel optimizations could redefine how efficient Linux could be on ARM hardware. Now think about features. Apple's Linux wouldn't just stop at performance. It would probably include iCloud integration, AirDrop, iMessage, FaceTime, things that Linux users have been trying to replicate for years. It would be the first Linux distro that feels personal, connected, and part of an ecosystem. Imagine sharing files from your Linux desktop to your iPhone with one click, no command line magic, no third-party tweaks, just native Apple smoothness. But here's the interesting part. Would Apple keep it open source? The Linux kernel itself is open source, sure. But Apple's layer on top, probably not. They'd likely build a hybrid model, open at the base, closed at the surface, something that gives the illusion of openness, but still lives under Apple's control. Developers would get flexibility, users would get polish, but freedom, maybe not entirely. Still, it would be the closest thing to open source Apple the world has ever seen. Now, let's talk about developers. This is where things get exciting. Apple could market this distro directly to programmers, offering a perfect bridge between macOS and Linux. Imagine running Xcode and Linux tools. Developers could deploy Docker containers, run Android emulators, or build for multiple platforms, all within Apple's beautifully designed Linux. It could become the dream system for cross-platform creators, from iOS apps to cloud servers. And what about the App Store? You can bet Apple would integrate it. But instead of a typical Linux package manager, Apple might introduce something new, a curated, secure, and visually polished app center. Every app verified, sandboxed, and optimized for performance. They could even bring paid apps and subscriptions to Linux, something the open source world has never fully embraced. That could change how developers monetize their software on Linux forever. Now, picture this. You walk into an Apple store. You see MacBooks running two options, macOS and Apple Linux. Same hardware, two paths, macOS for creators and general users, Apple Linux for developers, coders, and open source enthusiasts. It would be Apple's way of saying, we understand both worlds now. And honestly, that could be revolutionary. Of course, not everyone would celebrate. The Linux community is protective of its freedom. Many would argue that Apple's version of Linux ISN, Tefia Linux, that it compromises the open nature of the system. But others might see it differently. A bridge that brings more users into the Linux ecosystem. Even if it's through Apple's polished lens, it could finally make Linux mainstream on millions of Macs, used by millions of people who don't even realize they're using Linux underneath. Then there's the business angle. Why would Apple do it? The answer could be simple. Developers, Apple knows Linux dominates the server world, the cloud, and AI development. Launching a Linux distro could pull more developers into Apple's hardware ecosystem, keeping them coding on Macs instead of other devices. It's strategic, not just symbolic. But imagine the impact beyond developers. If Apple's Linux ran on other hardware like PCs, it could become the first truly consumer-friendly Linux distro. Beautiful, stable, plug and play. No driver issues, no terminal confusion, no endless tweaks. It would just work the Apple way. And that could redefine how people see Linux altogether. Now let's step into the future for a moment. Imagine 5 years after launch. Apple Linux has matured with millions of users worldwide. It's become the go-to OS for developers, students, and creators who want both flexibility and polish. Mac OS remains the flagship, but Apple Linux becomes the backbone of Apple's developer universe, powering servers, apps, and maybe even AI tools. Apple could use it as a bridge between its closed ecosystem and the open source community, finally connecting to worlds that were always divided. But as always, there's a catch. Apple never does anything without a plan, so even if it embraced Linux, it would still be on Apple's terms. You might get freedom, but only as much as Apple allows. And maybe that's the real twist in this story. Apple's version of Linux might not be a gift to open source. It could be a new kind of control, wrapped in a beautiful interface. Still, no matter how you see it, one thing's for sure. If Apple ever launched its own Linux distro, it would be one of the most fascinating moments in tech history. A turning point where design meets freedom, performance meets openness, and the world realizes that maybe, just maybe, the next big leap for Apple isn't iOS or macOS, but Linux. So, what do you think? Would you try Apple Linux if it existed? Would you trade full freedom for perfect performance and design? Or would you stick to your favorite distro and say, nice try, Apple? Whatever your answer, one thing's certain, it would be a wild, game-changing experiment. And until that day comes, we can only imagine what an Apple-powered Linux would truly look like.